Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about preparing for outstanding Dodd Frank compensation rule changes. And joining us to discuss this is Don Kalfen, who's a partner with Meridian Compensation Partners. Welcome, Don.
Thank you, TK.
So, the SEC has some unfinished business. In fact, it's been a while that this business has sort of been hanging around, but it's starting to get a little activity again. And so the SEC has yet to act on certain compensation or corporate governance related mandates, specifically mandating the clawback and its disclosure, and also the pay for performance disclosure. So, Don, tell us sort of what brought about the activity and what's being proposed for the new rules.
Sure, certainly. Just to provide a further time frame as to how slowly these things evolve, bear in mind, Dodd Frank was passed 10 years ago. The proposed rules were issued 5 years ago. And here we are wondering if the SEC is ever going to adopt final rules. And the SEC recently released this rulemaking agenda last month. And the proposed rules regarding the mandatory clawback rule and the disclosure of pay versus performance were both on the rulemaking agenda. However, the rulemaking agenda doesn't give us much hope that we'll see final rules anytime too soon. Under the agenda, the SEC has indicated it will issue proposed revised rules for the mandatory clawback within the short term. That's probably within 6 to 12 months. If they do issue proposed revised rules, then they'll have to provide for a comment period of at least 60 days, and then someday issue final rules. So this will stretch well into next year or even beyond. With respect to the pay for performance disclosure, the agenda has indicated that the SEC views this as a long-term rulemaking proposition and is not likely to issue either revised proposed rules or final rules until 12 months or more. So we're not likely to see any action on this proposed rule until late 2021 or perhaps into 2022.
So, Don, why now? Why is the SEC bringing this up? Is there something special that's happened that, they wanted to make changes? Has enough time passed that the world has changed and they feel that the old mandates that were proposed are, no longer valid, or what's the deal here?
Right. Well, Chairman Clayton of the SEC has been committed to clean up the remaining Dodd Frank rulemaking, and there's still a lot of rulemaking to be had well beyond the compensation area. So under his auspices, the SEC staff has been working overtime to try to push out final rules and proposed rules. But what's surprising in this case is that the SEC appears not prepared to issue final rules on either the clawback proposed rule or the pay for performance disclosure, which suggests the SEC is simply not happy with the previously proposed rule and may undertake wholesale changes to what the proposed rule looks like. And it remains to be seen the nature of those changes. But really, Chairman Clayton has been the catalyst to move forward this rulemaking and claims he wants to adhere to the rulemaking agenda. But I will provide one caveat. While the SEC has faithfully issued its rulemaking agenda every 6 months, it is under no obligation to meet its rough deadlines and generally does not meet them.
So does changes mean they have to put this out for opinions again and feedback?
Most likely. If they follow historic patterns, new revised proposed rules will be subject to a 60-day comment period, after which the SEC would have to review all comments, take them into account, and then issue a final rule, again, under no deadline to do so. So it's unclear when we might see final rules and when they may be effective. The wild card, of course, in this is if there's a change in administration at the White House, it's uncertain whether this will be a priority or not under a Biden administration. because clearly there will be a new SEC chair, and the Democrats will hold the majority of seats, although I believe they would likely favor most of this rulemaking, but whether it's accelerated is unclear.
So the key question here is sort of what should boards or compensation committees be doing in light of this recent activity and this the apparent resurrection of the status of these two mandates.
Right. Well, the good news is in the short term, there's no action that immediately needs to be taken by either boards or committees or executive management. I think they should still be aware these are coming down the pipeline. But equally important, since the proposed rules were issued on the mandatory clawback, large cap companies in particular have been very aggressive in implementing clawback rules. Uh, to a lesser extent, this has been true for mid cap and small cap. At this point in time, it's just considered good governance to have clawback policies in place. However, these clawback policies generally differ from the clawback policies required under Dodd Frank. Under Dodd Frank, a company will be required to claw back any so called excess incentive compensation. Under almost all public company clawback policies, and there's a few exceptions, it's not mandated but permissive. A company may, but it's not required to claw back excess incentive amounts paid to executive officers. And oftentimes, uh, company clawback policies require fault. That is, a financial restatement is due to the fault of an executive officer, and stats officers' excess incentive compensation that is subject to clawback. That's not the case under the proposed rule. It's a no-fault rule, meaning all executive officers' compensation would be subject to mandatory clawback if there is a financial restatement that resulted in excess incentive compensation. We do encourage companies to continually review the adequacy of their clawback policy and whether it needs to be refreshed and perhaps expanded to include other areas that might be ripe for clawback due to other triggering events besides a financial restatement. And we have seen clawback policies expand in this regard. With respect to the pay for performance disclosure, this has not been embraced by large, medium, or small size companies. Only a minority of companies have put in their proxy anything approaching the type of pay for performance disclosure that is mandated under Dodd Frank. And we don't anticipate the prevalence increasing anytime soon.
So we did on the clawback just recently, in fact, just in the news very recently, we saw an example of where that might come into play with McDonald's and their CEO, which certainly wasn't for a restatement. So I think it's certainly not a illogical mandate in the sense of what would be right for investors in a situation like that.
Right. The notion is why do companies have a clawback? It's to protect shareholder interests. That there's been either some type of misconduct or some type of ill-gotten gain, unjust enrichment, if you will, that needs to be recovered on behalf of shareholders and go back into corporate treasury. The McDonald's situation, unusual. We don't tend to see this after the fact, but McDonald's board investigated the conduct of the former CEO and determined, based on its findings, that he was not entitled to his severance payments. And because McDonald's has a clawback policy, they're able to seek recoupment of the severance payments that were made to the CEO.
Yeah. Well, Don, we're going to have you back once we see if any of this, how all this sort of solves itself. And so we can report on the final results of the mandates. But I wanted to thank you for taking the time to educate us on this recent activity and especially on what board should be doing today.
Right. Happy to do so. Thank you, TK.
Yeah. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic to help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.